When we first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I thought it was the perfect place to start a new chapter of our lives. The house had everything we could ever want. A big backyard where our kids could run around, a cozy kitchen that filled with sunlight every morning, and neighbors who seemed warm and welcoming. At least at first glance. It felt like something out of a magazine, all neat lawns and smiling faces. But as they say, looks can be deceiving. Not long after we settled in, I noticed a thick envelope sitting on our dining table. Homeowners Association Guidelines. The cover read. My husband, Mark, flipped through it casually, chuckling at some of the rules. No laundry hanging outside. Seriously, he said, shaking his head like it was all just a funny joke. At first I didn't think much about it either. Rules were rules, right? We'd signed up for them when we bought the house. So what if we couldn't hang clothes outside or leave our car in the driveway overnight? It wasn't the end of the world. For weeks, life went smoothly. Our kids rode their bikes down quiet streets lined with perfectly trimmed hedges. Neighbors waved politely from across fences, and everything seemed picture perfect. But then, one evening, while I was watering the flowers by our front porch, I overheard a conversation between Mrs. Harper, our next-door neighbor, and another resident. Their voices carried easily over the fence. Best not cross them, Mrs. Harper whispered sharply. They don't mess around. I froze mid-spray, water pooling at my feet. Who were they? What did she mean? At that moment, I realized there was more to this neighborhood than met the eye. Still, I told myself it was probably nothing. Just people being overly cautious about keeping things tidy. After all, everyone wanted their homes to look nice. Right? For a while, I tried to push the thought out of my mind. Life continued as usual. Our kids played outside, we attended a few block parties, and everything seemed fine. But deep down, something felt off. There was an unspoken tension in the air, like everyone was walking on eggshells. Conversations always stopped when I walked by, and some neighbors avoided eye contact altogether. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I asked Mark if he'd noticed anything strange. He shrugged it off, saying maybe I was reading too much into things. It's just a neighborhood, he said. People are weird everywhere. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface. Little signs started adding up. A family down the street suddenly put their house up for sale without warning. Another neighbor mentioned how strict the HOA board was during a casual chat, though she quickly changed the subject when I pressed her for details. Even the mail carrier seemed unusually quiet whenever I greeted him. Then came the first letter. It arrived slipped under our door one Tuesday afternoon. Inside was a neatly typed note stamped with the official seal of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. The message was polite but firm. Apparently, our flower pots weren't the right color according to Section 3.2 of the guidelines. They gave us 7 days to fix it or face penalties. Mark laughed when he saw it. Flower pot colors? Really? He said, holding the paper up like it was the most absurd thing he'd ever seen. But I felt a chill run down my spine. If they cared this much about flower pots, what else would they come after us for? That night, lying awake beside Mark, I stared at the ceiling, wondering what we'd gotten ourselves into. Was this really just about flower pots, or was there something bigger going on here? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. Life in Willow Creek Estates wasn't going to be as simple as I'd imagined. The letter about the flower pots was just the beginning. At first, I thought it was a small hiccup, something we could easily fix. So I went to the store, picked out new charcoal gray pots that matched the HOA's approved color scheme, and replaced the cheerful yellow ones. Problem solved, or so I thought. But then came the second letter. This time, it was about our car. Apparently, leaving it parked in the driveway overnight violated Rule 4.7, which required all vehicles to be stored exclusively in garages between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I couldn't believe it. We had a 2-car garage, but Mark used one side for his woodworking projects, and there wasn't enough space for both cars. It seemed like such a minor thing, yet here we were, being fined over it. Each letter felt like a punch to the gut. The fines weren't huge, $25 here, $50 there, but they added up quickly. Worse than the money, though, was the growing sense of unease. Every envelope slipped under our door made my heart race. What would it be about this time? Our mailbox alignment, the color of our curtains, the height of the grass. The tension seeped into every corner of our lives. Even mundane tasks became stressful. When I mowed the lawn, I double-checked the edges to make sure they were perfectly straight. If I hung decorations for the holidays, I agonized over whether they met the HOA's aesthetic standards. Every glance outside felt like I was waiting for someone to point out what we'd done wrong next. Mark tried to stay calm, but even he started showing signs of frustration. One evening, after receiving yet another notice, he threw the letter onto the kitchen counter and muttered, "This is ridiculous. Are we living in a house or a museum?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the rules seemed endless, and no matter how hard we tried to follow them, we always seemed to fall short. It was exhausting. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost unnoticeable. A neighbor might mention during a casual chat, "You really should take care of that," while gesturing vaguely toward our yard. Another would offer unsolicited advice about how to avoid fines. But soon, the comments grew sharper, more pointed. People stopped inviting us to block parties. Parents pulled their kids away when ours tried to play with them. It wasn't just the neighbors either. The HOA board itself seemed to loom larger with each passing day. They sent reminders weekly, sometimes daily, detailing every little infraction. Each note carried the same polite but menacing tone: comply or face consequences. And those consequences weren't just financial. They hinted at legal action, property lines, even eviction. One night, unable to sleep, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Was someone jotting down notes every time we stepped outside, reporting us for stepping off the sidewalk instead of the path? The paranoia crept in slowly, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Desperate for answers, I decided to dig deeper. I reread the HOA guidelines cover to cover, searching for loopholes or explanations. Some rules were laughably specific, like the one banning outdoor furniture cushions, unless they matched a pre-approved palette. Others were downright baffling, like the requirement to submit photos of holiday decorations for approval before putting them up. As I flipped through the pages, I realized something unsettling. These weren't just rules designed to keep things tidy. They were tools of control. Every guideline gave the HOA power, the power to fine us, shame us, and ultimately force us to conform. And if we refused, well, that was a risk I wasn't sure we were ready to take. By the time I finished reading, I felt trapped. Trapped in a house that no longer felt like home, in a neighborhood that no longer felt welcoming. The dream we'd moved here for was slipping further and further away. And worst of all, I had no idea how to get it back, or if we ever could. The day we received the summons to an emergency HOA meeting, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just a casual invitation. It was a formal notice, typed on official letterhead and slipped under our door, with the words asterisk asterisk, mandatory ATENDANC required asterisk asterisk, bolded at the top. Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat about neighborhood updates or holiday decorations. That evening, as we walked into the community center, the atmosphere was heavy. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where 5 stern-looking board members sat waiting. At the center was Mr. Caldwell, the HOA president, a tall, imposing man with cold blue eyes and a voice that could cut through steel. He didn't smile as people filed in. Instead, he surveyed the room like a principal addressing a group of misbehaving students. When everyone was seated, Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and began speaking. "Thank you for coming," he said, though his tone suggested anything but gratitude. His gaze swept across the room before landing on us. As many of you know, maintaining property values requires strict adherence to our guidelines. Unfortunately, recent infractions threaten the integrity of our neighborhood. He pulled out a folder and flipped it open. Mrs. Harper, thank you for reporting the unapproved tree trimming last month. Ms. Rodriguez, your complaint about excessive noise levels has been noted. And Mr. and Mrs. Carter. He paused dramatically, locking eyes with us. Your repeated violations cannot continue unchecked. My heart pounded wildly. Repeated violations. Sure, we'd gotten 2 letters, but surely others had done worse. Hadn't they? The room fell silent, and I could feel dozens of eyes boring into us. Some neighbors looked sympathetic, while others wore expressions of smug satisfaction, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. Mr. Caldwell went on to explain the consequences of non-compliance, escalating fines, legal action, even foreclosure in extreme cases. Each word hit me like a hammer. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about survival. If we didn't toe the line, we risked losing everything. After the meeting ended, whispers followed us out the door. A few neighbors offered weak smiles, but most avoided eye contact altogether. One woman even muttered under her breath as we passed, though I couldn't make out what she said. By the time we reached our car, I felt like I'd been put on trial and found guilty without a chance to defend ourselves. That night, lying awake beside Mark, I replayed the meeting in my mind. Why did the HOA have so much power? Who gave them the authority to dictate every aspect of our lives? And why did no one speak up against them? Mark broke the silence. Maybe we should just try harder, he said softly. Follow the rules exactly, down to the last detail. Maybe then they'll leave us alone. I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at me. Could we really live like that, constantly looking over our shoulders, second-guessing every decision? What kind of life was that? The next morning, I decided to reach out to Mrs. Harper. She'd lived here longer than anyone else on our street and clearly understood how things worked. Perhaps she could offer some advice, or at least shed light on why the HOA operated this way. Her reaction surprised me. Instead of offering guidance, she hesitated, glancing nervously toward her driveway. You shouldn't have come, she muttered, ushering me inside quickly. Once the door closed behind us, she lowered her voice. Listen carefully. Don't fight them. You'll lose. What do you mean? I asked, bewildered. Why does everyone act like they're untouchable? She sighed heavily, sinking onto her couch. Because they are. Look, years ago, there was another family, the Millers. They refused to follow the rules too, thought they could stand up to the HOA. One day, they disappeared, sold their house overnight, and vanished without a word. Goosebumps prickled along my arms. Are you saying? I'm saying, she interrupted, leaning closer, that sometimes it's better to blend in. Keep your head down. Do what they say. I left her house feeling colder than ever. If even seasoned residents feared speaking out, what chance did we have? That night, as I stared at the ceiling, I realized something terrifying. We weren't just fighting bureaucracy anymore. We were fighting for our place in this world. And the odds weren't in our favor. Desperate for advice, I turned to Mrs. Harper again. She'd lived in Willow Creek longer than anyone else on our street and seemed to know how the HOA operated better than most. Plus, she'd warned me once before. Maybe she'd help now. Her reaction surprised me. When I knocked on her door, she hesitated, glancing nervously toward her driveway before ushering me inside. Once the door closed behind us, she lowered her voice. You shouldn't have come, she muttered, as if someone might be listening. Why? I asked, confused. I just need some advice. You've been here longer than anyone. How do you deal with all of this? She sighed heavily, sinking onto her couch. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at her hands like they held all the answers. Finally, she spoke. Look, when I first moved here, I thought it was perfect too. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, everything so neat and tidy. But then I started noticing things. What kind of things? I pressed. She leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. Little things at first. Fines for leaving trash cans out an hour too long. Letters about lawn height. Then bigger stuff, families suddenly moving away without warning, neighbors turning on each other, and always the board watching, waiting for someone to slip up. I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you saying the HOA forces people out? Mrs. Harper didn't answer directly. Instead, she told me about the Millers. They were a young family who'd moved into the neighborhood years ago. At first, they seemed happy enough, but soon they started pushing back against the rules. They argued at meetings, refused to pay fines, and even hired a lawyer to challenge the HOA's authority. One day, Mrs. Harper continued. They were gone. Just like that. No goodbye, no explanation. Their house went up for sale overnight, and within days, new people moved in. No one talked about it after that. It was like they never existed. My stomach twisted. Do you think the HOA did something to them? Made them leave? She shrugged, but her expression said it all. Let's just say the HOA doesn't like troublemakers. And if you fight them, you'll become one. But what choice do we have? I asked, my voice trembling. If we keep following their rules, we'll lose ourselves. If we don't, they'll crush us. Mrs. Harper shook her head sadly. There's no winning, dear. Not unless you're willing to walk away entirely. But even then, she trailed off, looking uneasy. Even then, you never know what they might do. That night, I replayed her words in my mind over and over. Was the HOA really capable of driving people out? Of making their lives so miserable that leaving became the only option? It sounded extreme, almost unbelievable. Yet, deep down, I couldn't dismiss it entirely. The fines, the letters, the whispers, it all added up to something sinister. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. I approached a few neighbors casually, trying to gauge their feelings about the HOA. Some avoided eye contact or changed the subject quickly. Others gave vague responses, clearly uncomfortable discussing it. Only one person, a quiet man named Mr. Patel, was willing to talk openly. They're bullies, he said bluntly, leaning against his fence. They pick on whoever they think won't fight back. Most people just give in because it's easier. But you, he glanced at me cautiously. You're already on their radar. Be careful. His words echoed in my mind as I walked back home. Careful. That's what everyone kept telling me. But how could I be careful when every move I made felt like stepping into a trap? That evening, Mark noticed how quiet I was during dinner. What's wrong? He asked. I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. Finally, I said, I think we're in deeper than we realized. This isn't just about rules anymore. It's about control. Mark frowned, setting his fork down. What are you saying? I'm saying, I replied, meeting his gaze, that we might not have a choice anymore. We can either play by their rules or risk everything to stand up to them. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and doubts. Neither of us had an easy answer, but one thing was clear. Whatever path we chose, there would be no turning back. The tension in our house was unbearable. Every morning, I woke up dreading what new letter might be waiting under the door. Every evening, I scanned the neighborhood for signs of trouble. Was someone watching us? Taking notes? The paranoia never let up, and it wasn't just me feeling it. Mark started snapping at little things, like dishes left in the sink or shoes by the door. Our kids sensed the stress too. They'd grown quieter, more cautious, as if afraid to upset anyone. One Saturday morning, I decided we couldn't keep living like this. We had two choices: give in completely or fight back. Giving in meant losing ourselves, our freedom, our dignity. Fighting back was risky, but staying silent felt worse. So I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and began drafting a plan. First, I reread the HOA guidelines carefully. searching for inconsistencies or loopholes. Some rules were laughably vague, while others contradicted each other. For example, one section required all outdoor lights to match approved styles, but another said modifications needed pre-approval. It seemed impossible to follow both simultaneously. These contradictions could work in our favor if we presented them the right way. Next, I reached out to Mrs. Harper again. This time, she agreed to meet me secretly at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood. Over lukewarm lattes, I shared my idea. Gather evidence, build a case, and present it to the HOA board. If that didn't work, we'd escalate to the media, to lawyers, anywhere that would hold them accountable. To my surprise, Mrs. Harper nodded slowly. "I've been waiting years for someone to take a stand," she admitted. "If you're serious, count me in." With her help, I started reaching out to other neighbors discreetly. At first, people were hesitant. Years of fear had made them wary of speaking up. But once they realized they weren't alone, stories poured out. One family had been fined for having a bird bath that didn't match aesthetic standards. Another neighbor received a notice because their curtains were visible through the window, a violation of privacy protocols. Each story added fuel to our growing fire. We compiled affidavits, photos, and copies of letters sent by the HOA. The more evidence we gathered, the clearer it became. The board wasn't enforcing rules fairly. They were using them as weapons. People who questioned them faced harsher penalties, while favorites got away with blatant infractions. As our coalition grew, so did the whispers in the neighborhood. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer, must have caught wind of something because her behavior changed. She stopped patrolling the streets and avoided eye contact whenever I passed her house. For the first time, she looked nervous. But we weren't done yet. To ensure our voices would be heard, we called for a special HOA meeting. According to the bylaws, any homeowner could request one with enough signatures. And thanks to Mrs. Harper's connections, we had more than enough. When the date was set, word spread quickly. Residents packed the community center, eager to see what would happen next. That night, as I lay awake planning my speech, I felt a mix of fear and determination. What if the board retaliated? What if Karen turned the crowd against us? There were no guarantees, but one thing was certain: silence wouldn't save us anymore. Tomorrow, we'd face them head-on, and whatever happened, we'd do it together. For the first time in months, I fell asleep with a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could reclaim our neighborhood from the people who thought they owned it. The day of the special HOA meeting arrived, and nerves buzzed in the air like static electricity. The community center was packed. More people than I'd ever seen at one of these gatherings. Neighbors who usually avoided eye contact now sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering anxiously among themselves. Some looked angry, others scared, but everyone shared the same underlying tension. This wasn't just another routine meeting. It felt like a reckoning. Karen walked in late, her usual confident stride replaced by something closer to hesitation. She wore oversized sunglasses even indoors, and her sharp bob seemed slightly unkempt, uncharacteristic for someone who prided herself on perfection. As she took her seat at the head table, I noticed her hands gripping the edge tightly, knuckles white. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable. She looked human. Mrs. Harper kicked things off, standing up with a stack of papers in her hands. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it grew stronger. "We're here today because we can't stay silent anymore," she began. "For years, many of us have lived in fear. Fear of fines, fear of retaliation, fear of losing our homes. But no more. It's time to hold the board accountable." One by one, homeowners stood up to share their stories. A young couple recounted how they were fined for painting their front door a shade of blue that wasn't approved, despite sending multiple emails asking for clarification. An elderly man described being threatened with legal action when he installed a wheelchair ramp without prior approval, even though it was necessary for his mobility. Each story painted a picture of a neighborhood ruled not by fairness, but by intimidation. When it was my turn, I stepped forward, clutching my notes tightly. My heart raced, but I forced myself to speak clearly. I moved here thinking this would be a place where my family could thrive. I said, looking directly at Karen. Instead, we've been treated like criminals for things as small as flower pots and car parking. We've been fined unfairly, harassed relentlessly, and made to feel unwelcome in our own home. I held up a folder filled with documents. But none of this is about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. It's about control, about power, and we won't stand for it anymore. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I laid out our evidence. Conflicting rules, selective enforcement, and records of excessive fines levied against certain families, while others got away with clear violations. By the time I finished, the room buzzed with outrage. Even some board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, it was Karen's turn to respond. She stood slowly, adjusting her glasses as if buying time. When she spoke, her voice lacked its usual authority. "These accusations are baseless," she insisted, though her tone wavered. "The HOA exists to maintain standards for everyone's benefit." Her defense fell flat. Voices erupted from the audience, calling her out for hypocrisy and demanding answers. Someone shouted, "Why should we trust you?" Another added, "You've bullied us for years." The once polished president looked cornered, shrinking under the weight of collective anger. Then came the final blow. The chairwoman of the board, a quiet woman named Linda who rarely spoke up, cleared her throat and addressed the room. "After reviewing the evidence presented tonight," she said firmly, "the board has voted unanimously to remove Ms. Richardson from her position as HOA president, effective immediately." The room went silent. Karen's face turned pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Before she could protest, security guards appeared at the door, escorting her out quietly. No dramatic exit, no fiery rebuttal, just the stunned silence of someone who'd finally been exposed. As she disappeared from view, the room erupted into applause. People hugged each other, tears streaming down faces. For the first time in years, hope filled the air. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the thought. Was this really over? Or was it just the beginning of a long road to healing? In the weeks following Karen's removal, Willow Creek Estates began to transform. The change wasn't immediate. It was subtle at first, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. Neighbors who had once avoided each other started saying hello again. Kids played freely in the streets without fear of complaints about noise levels. Even the mail carrier seemed friendlier, lingering for a quick chat instead of rushing past. The new leadership worked hard to rebuild trust. Linda, the chairwoman, called for open meetings where residents could voice concerns without judgment or retaliation. She encouraged transparency, posting all decisions online and inviting feedback before implementing changes. The oppressive weight of constant scrutiny lifted, replaced by a sense of shared responsibility. Rules still existed, but they were enforced fairly and with kindness rather than intimidation. For our family, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after everything we'd been through. I stopped waking up in a cold sweat, wondering what letter might be waiting under the door. Mark relaxed too. His shoulders weren't perpetually tense anymore. Our kids laughed more, their energy bouncing off the walls again. It felt like breathing fresh air after months underwater. But even as things improved, the scars remained. Every time I passed Karen's old house, now vacant, I couldn't help but wonder where she'd gone. Rumors swirled that she'd moved to another state, possibly to join a similar community where she could wield her power unchecked. Part of me hoped she'd learned something from the experience, but deep down, I doubted it. Some people don't change easily. Still, the victory gave me strength. Standing up to Karen taught me lessons I'd carry for the rest of my life. The importance of resilience, the value of speaking out, and the power of unity. When we banded together, we proved that no one, not even someone as domineering as Karen, was untouchable. We reclaimed our neighborhood, not just from her, but from the culture of fear she'd created. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark joined me with 2 cups of tea. "You know," he said, handing me one, "I think we're finally home." I smiled, sipping the warm drink. Yeah, for the first time, I really believe it. Yet, there were moments when doubt crept back in. Late at night, lying awake beside Mark, I'd replay everything in my mind. What if Karen came back? What if someone else took her place, determined to rule with an iron fist? These thoughts haunted me occasionally, but they no longer controlled me. I reminded myself that we'd faced the worst and survived. If trouble arose again, we'd handle it together. The community continued to heal. Block parties resumed, holiday lights twinkled brighter than ever, and neighbors helped each other without hesitation. Mrs. Harper became a close friend, often stopping by to share gardening tips or stories about her grandchildren. Mr. Patel waved enthusiastically whenever he saw us, his quiet demeanor replaced by genuine warmth. Even Ms. Rodriguez, who had once reported us for noise violations, apologized during a chance encounter at the grocery store. Looking back, I realized how much we'd grown, not just as individuals, but as a community. The fight against Karen brought us closer, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths and stand up for what was right. In doing so, we found something far more valuable than pristine lawns or matching flower pots: connection. Life isn't perfect here, and maybe it never will be. But perfection isn't the goal. It's balance, understanding, and compassion that matter most. And for now, Willow Creek feels like a place where those things can thrive. As I watered my flowers one sunny morning, I caught sight of a neighbor hanging laundry outside, a small act of defiance that made me grin. No one complained. No letters appeared under doors. Instead, laughter echoed across yards, mingling with birdsong. For the first time in a long time, peace felt real. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for.